In 1995, though almost no one recognized the moment for what it was, Japan's working-age population reached its highest point in the country's history. Roughly 87.3 million people between the ages of 15 and 64. It has been declining ever since, every single year for 3 decades. By 2024, that number had fallen to 73.7 million, a drop of 16%, and the decline is projected to continue for decades more. Japan's total population followed a similar path, peaking later in 2008. At around 128 million people, it has fallen every year since. At first, the effects were easy to miss. Japan remained one of the world's largest economies. Its cities remained dense and modern, its trains remained famously punctual. But underneath that surface, a demographic engine that had powered 7 decades of post-war growth was quietly running in reverse. And by the 2020s, the consequences had become impossible to ignore. The core of the problem is simple arithmetic, playing out over an unusually long time scale. Japan's total fertility rate, the average number of children born per woman, has sat around 1.2 in recent years, far below the 2.1 needed to keep a population stable across generations. That gap has compounded year after year. Since fertility first dropped below replacement level in the 1970s, each smaller generation grows up to have an even smaller generation after it. A pattern demographers call population momentum, and one that is exceptionally difficult to reverse once it takes hold. Government researchers project that if current fertility and immigration trends continue, Japan's population, roughly 123 million as of the mid-2020s, will fall to around 96 million by 2060 and below 70 million by the end of the century. The most recent data makes the trend concrete rather than theoretical. Japan's population declined for the 14th consecutive year running, dropping by roughly 900,000 people in a single 12-month period, the largest one-year drop ever recorded. Of the country's 47 prefectures, 45 showed population decline. Only Tokyo and one neighboring prefecture grew, pulling in young workers from a shrinking countryside that increasingly has fewer of them to spare. The working-age share of the population fell below 60%, a threshold that has not recovered since 2018. While the share of the population aged, 75 and older, climbed past 17%. This is where the story stops, being only about demographics, and becomes a story about the entire structure of Japan's economy, because a shrinking workforce does not shrink evenly. It shrinks fastest in exactly the sectors that keep daily life running: construction, elder care, transportation, retail, and small manufacturing. Nearly 2/3 of small and medium-sized businesses in Japan, the backbone of its regional economies, now report ongoing labor shortages. One government think tank has projected that by 2030, with a population still around 120 million, Japan will face a labor supply shortfall of approximately 3.41 million workers, a gap forecast to grow substantially larger in the years that follow. Businesses have responded the way economic textbooks predict they should. By substituting capital for labor wherever possible, investment in labor-saving technology has accelerated sharply in exactly the industries hit hardest by the shortage: hospitality, food service, and retail among them. Convenience stores have automated checkout. Hotels have deployed robotic front desk staff. Care facilities, facing perhaps the most acute shortage of all, given Japan's aging population, have begun trialing robotic lifting aids and monitoring systems designed to let a smaller number of human caregivers manage a larger number of elderly residents. None of this has been enough on its own. To close the gap, the other major response has been immigration, a genuine shift for a country long associated with strict limits on foreign residency. The number of foreign residents in Japan has grown substantially, surging by hundreds of thousands in a single recent year to a record total, with foreign workers now representing a meaningfully larger share of the labor force than at any point in the country's modern history. Roughly a quarter of the country's foreign workforce is now concentrated in manufacturing and technology roles, precisely the sectors most acutely short-handed. But even this accelerating trend has not been enough to offset the scale of the underlying decline. And it has arrived slowly enough and remains politically sensitive enough that most economists do not expect immigration alone to resolve the shortfall. The human dimension of this crisis is where it becomes difficult to discuss purely in economic terms. Across Japan, the phenomenon known as akiya, abandoned or vacant homes, has become a visible marker of depopulation. Entire neighborhoods and villages where houses stand empty because there is no one left to inherit or occupy them. Local governments in some rural areas have taken to giving these homes away for free, or nearly free, simply to keep communities from disappearing entirely. With limited success, and in a statistic that captures the crisis at its most personal scale, national police data recorded more than 76,000 people who died alone in their homes in a single recent year, with more than 3/4 of them aged 65 or older. A phenomenon Japan has given its own name, kodakushi, or lonely death, precisely because it has become common enough to require one. The fiscal consequences reach into the core machinery of the state. As the elderly population continues to grow through at least the mid-2040s, while the working-age population continues shrinking, Japan's old age dependency ratio, the number of retirees relative to working-age adults, has already more than doubled since the mid-1990s and is projected to keep climbing toward roughly 3 retirees for every 4 working adults by 2060. Every pension payment, every healthcare subsidy, every long-term care benefit is funded, directly or indirectly, by a workforce that keeps getting smaller relative to the population depending on it. Japan's own prime minister has publicly stated that the country stands at the edge of being unable to maintain basic social functions if current trends continue unaddressed. An unusually blunt admission from a sitting head of government about the trajectory of his own nation. What makes Japan's experience matter well beyond its own borders is timing. Japan is not an outlier confronting a uniquely Japanese problem. It is, in the words of researchers who study this pattern, at the frontier of a demographic transition now underway across most of East Asia and much of Europe, arriving in those countries roughly a generation behind where Japan already stands. South Korea's fertility rate has fallen even lower than Japan's. China's working-age population has already begun its own decline. Italy, Germany, and other European economies are tracking a similar curve, only somewhat later along it. Japan, having entered this transition first, is now functioning as an unintentional case study decades ahead of everyone else. For what an advanced economy actually looks like is its foundational assumption: a reliably growing, or at least stable pool of working-age people quietly stops being true. Not every consequence has been purely negative. Labor scarcity has pushed wages upward in several sectors after decades of stagnation. And employment rates among older workers and women have both climbed to among the highest levels in the entire G7. Evidence that Japan's labor market has found some genuine flexibility within an otherwise difficult structural constraint. Some researchers argue that aging societies, forced by necessity, become genuine laboratories for innovation in robotics, automation, elder care technology that other nations will eventually need as well. Optimists point to Tokyo specifically, projected to retain enough labor demand through the 2030s to mask, at least temporarily, the severity of the shortage playing out across the rest of the country, but masking a problem in the capital is not the same as solving it in the regions. And the regions are where Japan's demographic story is actually being written. One closed school, one shuttered rural clinic, and one empty house at a time. What Japan now faces is not a temporary labor shortage that a good economic cycle will eventually correct. Its own researchers describe it, without much hedging, as the arrival of a genuinely limited labor supply society, a phrase suggesting not a passing shortage of workers, but a permanent recalibration of what an economy can realistically sustain once it stops being able to assume that tomorrow's workforce will simply be there. The way it always used to be, Japan did not run out of workers in a single crisis, a single recession, or a single failed policy. It arrived here through 5 decades of a birth rate quietly sitting below replacement level, compounding generation after generation, until a country famous for its discipline, its infrastructure, and its economic ambition found itself confronting a much harder problem than any of those strengths were built to solve. There were simply not enough people left to keep doing all the things a modern economy requires.